publication in journalism and sociology at Stony Brook University. I'm a longtime affiliate of Heterodox Academy. And so the argument that I'm going to make over the course of my talk is that a lot of times when we talk and think about censorship and what to do about censorship, we focus a lot on things like law and policies. The argument that I want to try to make here is that laws and policies are probably not going to get us as much progress as we might think or hope, because the main challenge that we face in many of our institutions of knowledge production is fundamentally a cultural problem. So to start with, to kind of frame this issue, there are lots of polling and survey data that suggest that academics tend to be more likely to censor others, more likely to self-censor than most other Americans. And this is especially true, this is true even if you look at the general level, but when you go to concrete cases, because everyone supports academic freedom in principle, but then when you're like, hey, would you support this person being able to talk? A lot, you get the numbers shrink a lot. So this is from an article that I published on my website from a study that was done by Cato Institute that looked at people at colleges and universities versus people in the general public. And you can see that academics are more likely to view most things as hate speech, a broader class of things as hate speech than the general public. They're more likely to self-censor on basically any topic than the general public. They're more likely to support the censorship of almost anything in the general public. One stereotypical exception to this rule is that academics tend to be more tolerant of flag burning and saying America is evil. But shy of that, on almost anything else, the academics are more likely to support the censorship of others and more likely to censor themselves. And this is striking, it's actually kind of wild, because for most other workers in the United States, they basically have no rules at all, protecting freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of association, privacy, any of that. Even First Amendment, basic First Amendment rules don't apply in many workplaces. There's some great books on this by Elizabeth Anderson and Sohrab Ahmari. So at public universities, we're protected by the First Amendment. Even at private universities, they typically have rules that robustly protect freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of conscience, and so on. So academics actually have a lot more formal freedom than basically anyone else in society, but we're also a lot more censorious and more likely to self-censor. So that's an interesting puzzle. Legally, students and faculty are very free. As David French noted in this article and in a recent talk, you know, a lot of the big battles for free speech have already been waged and won. Things like speech codes in most colleges and universities have been rolled back. Even newer innovations like DEI statements and things like this are being actively rolled back. And in a recent talk that I joined David at, he mentioned that, you know, running these kinds of free speech cases, they overwhelmingly win when they get to court. It's mostly you just show up to court, you collect your W, you collect your paycheck, and you go to the next one. They overwhelmingly win. In terms of laws and rules, academics in the United States are basically freer than they've ever been. They're freer than almost anyone else, any other type of worker in the United States, and they're freer than academics are in pretty much almost any other place in the world. In terms of our legal, actual freedoms, we have a ton of them, and they're expanding all the time, and when they go to court, when people try to violate those freedoms and you take them to court, they lose. They lose 9/10 out of the time, and it's still important to, when people do try to violate our rights and freedoms, to take them to court so that they know they can't just do that. But when they do get to court, they overwhelmingly win. Academics, on paper, very free, about as free as you can get. So if scholars are free in terms of rules and laws, then why are universities such censorious places? Well, the problem is it's not about rules and policies, it's about culture. If scholars are not taking advantage of the existing rules, laws, and protections that they have, then multiplying the rules and laws and protections probably won't do much to change the censorious nature of the institutions. If you want to change the censorious nature of the institutions, then you have to work on culture. To illustrate this point, I'll just tick through a couple of important facts. One of them being that censorship, when you look at who's actually driving censorship, it's driven heavily by scientists themselves, as Dr. Clark and colleagues recently pointed out in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. When we talk and think about censorship, we often think about governments or corporations or kids these days or Fox News. I was canceled following a Fox News witch hunt, by the way, so that's something that I have personal experience. Canceled as in lost an academic job. But there's kind of two things to bear in mind here. First is that in a lot of these campaigns, when we focus on, say, the kids these days, we miss who the actual decision makers are, how power actually operates. A handful of kids going meh on Twitter, they don't have the power to remove anyone from their job. The people who actually remove people from their jobs are the ones who are making these decisions. And so when we focus too much on the kids these days, or on Fox News and so on, then we actually miss who has power, how that power is exercised, who the decision makers are, how they're making their decisions. But more to the point, when we look at who's actually driving most of the censorious dynamics within campuses, within colleges and universities, within scientific institutions and fields, the call is almost always coming from inside the house. Why? Well, one of the drivers of this dynamic is that universities were not comprised of a random or representative slice of society. One of the things that drives universities being such censorious places is that the kinds of people that colleges and universities tend to select for, both when we're looking at students and when we're looking at faculty, at basically every level, we tend to select people who, relative to the general public, are much more likely to be conformist, are much more likely to be intolerant of views that diverge from our own, are much more likely to be dogmatic and extreme ideologically compared to the general public, and are much more concerned about status. So I talk about this at length in my recent book that was mentioned earlier, We Have Never Been Woke. There's a section called Disciplined Minds that looks at how people who get folded into knowledge institutions compared to the general public tend to be a lot more conformist and censorious. I have an article recently on my Substack that illustrates that brings together a lot of other research on how we tend to be more intolerant and dogmatic and status-oriented on the general public. So one of the things that drives these cultural dynamics in our institutions is the fact that the people who end up in these institutions just aren't normal people. And not only are we kind of weird, but the process of being enculturated in these institutions tends to exacerbate the kind of weird tendencies the unusual tendencies we already have. So like, for instance, how do you get into an elite university? Well, the main way that you get into an elite university is if you're the kind of person who shows up to school consistently and turns in your assignments in accordance with the specifications of the instructor, and who really cares what authorities think and ingratiate yourself with teachers, and you do the right extracurricular activities, but you don't have any disciplinary problems, and so on and so forth. So we actually select for people who are highly capable and conscientious conformists. That's the main thing that we select for when we decide who gets to come into our institutions, especially our elite institutions. And then as you proceed through institutions, how do you get tenure? Well, the story that we often hear and tell other people is that the way you get tenure is you keep your head down and your tail between your legs. You don't do anything, you don't rock the boat, you don't do anything. And then once you get tenure, that's when you go pew, pew, pew. But the thing is, if you spent the last 4 years in undergrad, 6 years minimum in grad school, another 6 years on the tenure track, keeping your head down and your tail between your legs, by the time that it's time to go pew, 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 you're no longer that kind of person. You're no longer a pew, pew, pew person. You're the kind of person who keeps your head down and your tail between your legs, and you're probably going to tell your PhD students and other people to do the same thing, because it works for you. There's this problem, this survivorship bias, where like a lot of times what we don't see and what the people we advise when we tell them to play it safe, what they don't see is all of the other people who betrayed themselves for nothing. They kept their head down, they kept their tail between their legs, they did all the conventional things that everyone else is doing, and they didn't get a flippin' job. But what we think is that what a lot of us think, a lot of us end up running through what Greg Lukianoff calls the conformity gauntlet, where at every stage we prove ourselves to be the kind of person who plays ball, who keeps their head down, who keeps their tail between the legs, who doesn't do trouble, who conforms with the prevailing things, and that's how we get our jobs and advance through the ranks. Most of the people who aren't down for this either get washed out or they quit. They leave. They do something else with their life because they find it distasteful to be in these institutions. And so the short is that we select for people who are conscientious, highly capable conscientious conformists, and the longer you stay in these institutions, the more you become that way. And one thing that's striking is that, again, like on paper, just as a matter of fact, tenure actually provides real protection for people. So this is some data that I put together using data from FIRE. When you look at faculty who get targeted for cancellation and whether or not they get fired, you can see people who are adjuncts and lecturers, about half the time they get targeted, they get fired. They lose their jobs. Again, know it firsthand. Tenured professors, 1/5 is likely to get fired, about 10% of the time. So having tenure protections, even being on the tenure track, provides real protection, real insulation. It actually does prevent you from getting targeted, from getting fired or sanctioned if you do get targeted. But when you look at polls and surveys, professors who have tenure are no less likely to censor or self-censor than faculty who don't. And this is in part because when you look at polling and survey data about why people self-censor, the main thing that they're concerned about, typically, isn't formal sanction. They're not so much worried about being fired. They're not so much worried about getting a bad grade. They are worried about those things. But the main thing that people seem to be worried about is social sanctions. They want to be included. They want to be liked. They don't want to be the person where they walk in the room and before they even start talking, everyone's like, oh, God. Like, they want to get invited to things, and so on and so forth. And these social concerns, these concerns about being liked and included and whatever, seem to drive a lot of censorship and self-censorship. And then I'll add, as it relates to punishment, investigations, even when they don't result in sanction, are often the kind of punishment of their own. So even if you're a tenured professor and you recognize that if people come for you, you're not likely to get fired, the fact that you're going to have to go through all this rigmarole to not get fired itself leads some people to self-censor. Again, the kind of people who become faculty tend to be very risk-averse and conformist compared to the general population, and so these kinds of things weigh more heavily on us, even more so than they do other workers. And then the last thing I'll say on this point is that the stochastic nature of a lot of these campaigns, the fact that you're never really sure who's going to come for you, if people are going to come for you, what the lines are, who the people, like the uncertain and stochastic nature of these campaigns, the fact that they're not heavily organized with the clear, bright rules of what to do and what not to do and so on, actually makes it more likely that people will censor and self-censor, as Hannah Arendt and others pointed out. It's actually the arbitrariness and uncertainty enhances the propensity of people to censor, compared to if they knew who the people to avoid were, what the rules were, what the things you can say and can't say. Under that circumstance where there's a lot of censorship but people know what the rules are, they are a lot more likely to say edgy things than if they just live in uncertainty about who or if people will come for them. Okay. So I said tenure is a system that's supposed to promote freedom, but in practice, what it leads people to do is keep their head down and their tail between their legs and avoid risk and become just an even more risk-averse person than they already were. Tenure isn't the only system and institution that we have in our institutions that's supposed to promote freedom, but in practice does the opposite. A lot of our institutions, as Jonathan Rauch pointed out, are also oriented under the idea that, well, that we all have our biases and limitations, we all have partial and situated knowledge, and then if you have stakeholders who have different interests, different values, different priorities colliding together, then you can produce something that's more like comprehensive, objective knowledge and so on, that we can correct our own errors and shortcomings together, collectively. And so we have a lot of these adversarial, team-based decision-making processes, like committee decisions about who to admit, hire, and promote, or peer review, and things like this. The only thing is, like, these systems only work as intended when you do have substantive diversity in terms of values, interests, and priorities. In the world we live in, where academia is comprised of a narrow and idiosyncratic slice of society, these same institutions, like peer review and committee decision-making and so on, can actually make it harder for novel ideas to break through, harder for people to dissent. It can make things like misinformation cascades more likely, not less likely, and so on. So a lot of systems and institutions that are that were designed around academic freedom actually serve the opposite purpose as a result of how these fields and institutions are comprised. Another cultural point is that many faculty and students don't know their rights. They don't understand what their rights are. They don't know who they should consult if their rights are violated. They don't know why they have these rights to begin with or how they were put into place. They can't articulate in a meaningful way why these freedoms are important, what would be lost if they were undermined. And so they, as a consequence of that, when you have illiberal parties that are trying to undermine and erode our rights and our freedoms, it's impossible for a lot of us to defend them in a compelling way. We're not even sure if we should defend them in many cases. And so this is ironically a failure of education and education institutions, but this is another example of a kind of cultural problem where the point isn't that we don't have the laws protecting our stuff, it's that we have these laws, but no one knows what they are, or a lot of us aren't or insufficiently familiar with what they are, why they matter, and so on and so forth. And then my last point is, one reason why it's important to think in terms of culture as opposed to formal rules and norms is that one thing that you see that I show in my book and in some of my other research, including this article, is that like after 2010, we saw a lot of things that shifted at once. We saw the number of students, this is from Heterodox Academy's campus expression survey at the top, the number of students who censor on various topics went up after 2010, peaked around 2021 and started to go down. Research on prejudice and discrimination went up after 2010, peaked around 2021 on the way down. In terms of FIRE and other organizations measuring cancel culture incidences, you see this spike, and peaked around 2021 on the way down. Jonathan Rausch, in his presentation, put up another graph where you saw this same thing, a peak after 2021 and on the way down. So understanding why it is that we see all of this stuff moving at once, how these things relate to each other, how does the focus on identity relate to the propensity to self-censor, relate to some of these campaigns to get people fired, and so on. To understand these dynamics and how they're playing out and why they're playing out and how these things relate to each other, again, you really need to look at culture. Like laws and rules and norms won't get you there. Okay, so I'll stop talking there. I feel like I'm at time or around time. There's me reading my book, which you should buy. My email address and Substack is up there. Thank you for your time.